The term black sheep is often used to describe someone or something that sticks out negatively among the rest of the bunch. If you go to a dictionary, the black sheep is a person who has done something that brings shame or disappointment to their families. While the darker color of a sheep's wool depends solely on their genes, when applied to humans, the term is only gained after doing something deemed as shameful or terrible. Now, on the topic of video games, it is common for people to depict certain entries as the black sheep of their respective sagas. Be it because of them taking a different approach, or because their quality being largely inferior to previous installments, these games are often looked down on, thus receiving the Ovine-originated title. However, among all of them, I want to draw your attention to two very specific games that have suffered that very same fate. Two titles of the action-adventure genre that, while welcomed upon release, they became a target for the backlash of many players years after. These two number 2s are, of course, Zelda II, The Adventure of Link, and Castlevania II, Simon's Quest. My name is BurnCrowSP, and this is the story of the world's most well-known black sheeps, and how their legacy has lived on, without many of us noticing. So, sit back, and let's dive in. Okay, but before getting into that, allow me to tell you about a pretty cool game that's coming up very soon. Code Bunny, the high-octane action platformer created by Team 7 Star, is finally arriving on Steam. While the official release date has yet to be announced, wishlists will soon be open, since the launch is expected to happen during the last quarter of 2024. This is a game I personally recommend, since I believe it's one of the best indie platformers I've played in a long time. And if you don't trust me, I have a 50-minute video about it where I tell you why you should too play this game. And it's only going to get better since the Steam version will arrive with even more content compared to the original itch.io release, which is still available if you don't feel like waiting. All links are down in the description, and well, that said, let's get back to the show. In order to truly understand the topic at hand, we need to travel back in time to the year 1986. On that year's 21st of February, Hyrule Fantasy Zelda no Densetsu was released by Nintendo for their Famicom Disk System. In this game, players take the role of Link, a boy who must recover the 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom, in order to defeat Ganon, the Prince of Darkness, and free both Princess Zelda and the Kingdom of Hyrule from his evil clutches. To do so, they must explore a massive world, collecting items and gathering the clues that will help them solve the riddle behind each of the Triforce pieces, hidden inside sprawling dungeons. While there are examples of action-adventure games that came before it, the concept behind Hyrule Fantasy cemented what the genre was all about. Just 1 year after they shook the world with Super Mario Bros., Nintendo had done it again. They proved how video games could be more than just a bunch of screens, or a race for the highest score. They could be a window to a different world, filled with secrets and legends to uncover. It goes without saying that Hyrule Fantasy was a massive success, selling more than 6 million copies between its original Disk System release and its international cartridge-based counterpart. This version arrived in 1987, now known as The Legend of Zelda, removing the Hyrule Fantasy title from its name. But even before the Western world had the chance to experience this now legendary game, the sequel was already out in Japan. And that begs the question, how do you follow up on something this groundbreaking? Nowadays, video game sequels have a standard per se. You're free to diverge from that same path, but usually number 2s take what worked on the previous installment, fix what was wrong, and amplify both with new ideas that kick the concept into a new gear. Back then though, the answer was not as clear, and having a game a bit too similar to its predecessor could get you in quite a pickle. Thing is, Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, the two minds behind The Legend of Zelda, didn't have an answer either, but that soon changed, however. According to Tadashi Sugiyama, one of Zelda II's directors, it all began when, one day, Miyamoto came into the office with a new idea. In an interview posted by Nintendo in 2016, shown on their JP website, he explained, he wanted to make a side-scrolling action game that made use of up and down movements for attacks and defense. Types of moves that weren't possible in the first game. Rather than being a continuation of the series, it started as a new sword and shield type of action game. This new concept for an action game, although led by Miyamoto, was being worked on by a completely different team. It wasn't until late in development that this idea transformed into the next step for The Legend of Zelda, with Takashi Tezuka joining in to work on the story and setting of the game. And so, on January 14, 1987, barely 11 months after the original game's release date, The Legend of Zelda II: Link No Vulcan arrived at the Famicom Disk System. On the other side of things, the story surrounding Castlevania II's development is rather different. To begin with, even though Zelda II and Castlevania II belong in the same genre, their predecessors couldn't be more different. That is, if you only look at Castlevania for the NES. Even if most players never knew at the time, the original NES entry, titled Akumajo Dracula in Japan, was being developed alongside an MSX2 game that, despite originally sharing the same title, became known overseas as Vampire Killer. The main faces behind this double project were those of Akihiko Nagata and Hitoshi Akamatsu. What makes this truly interesting is that despite sharing the same producer and designer, the only thing these two games have in common is the setting. While the NES version is a platformer, Vampire Killer is closer to an adventure game, with players having to find keys, solve puzzles, and acquire new items that expand on the main character's abilities. So, when the responsibility to answer the dilemma of the sequel fell upon Hitoshi Akamatsu, the decision was to build up on both versions of Castlevania, rather than choosing one over the other. In the end, this sequel turned out to be much more than that. Released for the FDS in August of 1987, a few months after our other protagonist made its debut, Akumajo Dracula 2 had become a reality. These two games, however, despite coming from very different teams and carrying a vastly different development story, years after, their destinies turned out to be one and the same. It is no secret that Zelda II and Castlevania II are very divisive games, often considered to be some of, if not the worst games of their respective franchises. Or at least, for a long period of time, they used to be known that way. More than 20 years after the original release, these two NES games had suddenly garnered a pretty interesting reputation, not only by users on the internet, but also by the video game press. So much so that by 2007, the year in which Zelda II was released for the Wii Virtual Console, IGN posted a review of the game that started off like this: "Nobody likes Zelda II." That's not true, of course, but it's an easy impression to get. While it's difficult to point out when it exactly happened, during the early 2000s, Zelda II quickly became one of the most bashed NES games out there. If you search around for reviews posted by players during that time frame, you can clearly see that, despite some people showing appreciation for the game, most opinions were either mixed or downright negative. Users found it to be a very unfair game, with a frustrating life system that forces you to go back to the starting point after a game over. Others critiqued how cryptic the clues to the next objective felt at times, mentioning how, quote-unquote, most NPCs tell you useless garble, like the infamous I am error. Heck, not even their own developers seemed too fond of Zelda II. In 2003, the Superplay magazine interviewed Shigeru Miyamoto as a celebration of the 70th anniversary of the franchise. When the journalist consulted him about Zelda II, he said the following: "Compared to Legend of Zelda, Zelda II went exactly how we expected. All games I make usually get better in the development process, since good ideas keep coming, but Zelda II was sort of a failure." And if you thought Link's second outing had a bad time on the early internet, Castlevania II had it even worse. Because while Zelda II was known for its flaws, Simon's Quest's reputation could be summed up in just 3 words. And in fact, you can probably hear those words just by looking at this picture. Yeah, basically what most people knew about CB2 was that this game sucks. For years, Castlevania II was the running joke of internet commentators, and that is how most players began talking about it as the black sheep of the series. Its cryptic puzzles, low-quality boss fights, and different direction compared to the 1986 game suddenly became the main traits that people recognized it for. Here's where things get interesting though. This all happened around the 2000s and 2010s for a reason. Those 2 decades saw the uprise of the internet as we know it today. Just as I mentioned on the gimmick video, games of the past saw a return to form thanks to the popularity of emulators. From that point onward, both the old and new generation of video game enthusiasts began sharing the same space. In the case of Zelda II and Castlevania II though, this renaissance backfired, and what most people got to know about these games is what makes them bad, rather than the full picture. So then, let's go for a change. We all know about the flaws of these games, but you'd be surprised about how much there is to love about them too. These 2 sequels, in my eyes, share the same main theme behind their core mechanics. Both development teams had the ambitious desire of breaking through the limits of their previous work. So, both Zelda II and Castlevania II have a much grander scope, with worlds that no other game had been able to portray at that time. While The Legend of Zelda had Link exploring a piece of Hyrule, Zelda II has the hero traveling through uncharted territory, sailing across the seas and exploring multiple continents. And while Castlevania had Simon entering the dangerous lair of Dracula, Simon's Quest has the player exploring the entirety of Transylvania. But when it comes to the main pieces that the gameplay is composed of, each game took a different approach. Zelda II carries a lot of the identity of its predecessor, taking place a few years after Link defeated Ganon atop Death Mountain. In order to awaken the real Princess Zelda from her slumber, he must unlock the power of the Triforce of Courage, which has manifested after his 16th birthday. And so he sets off to the Great Palace to complete a brutal test and prove himself worthy of the Sacred Triangle's last piece. To gain access to it, however, he must place a gem inside the core of 6 different palaces, all scattered across the land of Hyrule. While the overworld exploration maintains the same perspective, whenever Link comes in contact with any enemy or location, Zelda II morphs into a side-scroller. This change was not made on a whim, rather it's meant to be a way to properly implement the idea that gave birth to this game. It was done to allow the complex combat system that Miyamoto was aiming for to exist. And since it's easily its most innovative feature, it's clear to see why they risk it all for it. In Zelda II, Link still fights using a sword and a shield. However, he can now attack and defend high or low. While it may seem like a minor change, this opened up a wide variety of possibilities when it comes to enemy designs. Players are required to analyze what the enemy is doing, block any incoming attacks, and then respond with a sword slash at the right altitude. You might think that this complexity would be the source of the complaints about the difficulty, and to an extent it is. However, the game does a great job at easing your learning curve by putting you against very simple enemies during your first minutes of gameplay, like blobs who can defend themselves or spear-wielding fellows that will never change stances. It isn't until the first dungeon, the Parapa Palace, that you'll find your first skill check in the game, taking the form of a Darknut. Don't get me wrong though, Zelda II is still a very challenging game, but it is mostly very fair. For every Roth area, there is something nearby that will help you boost Link's abilities and give you a bigger chance of winning. And even if failing can be frustrating, as your avatar becomes stronger, you as the player will be smarter. You'll learn enemy patterns and how to counter them, and most important of all, you'll learn how to use your spells like an absolute magician. Magic was introduced to the series for the first time, and it takes the support role on Link's arsenal. As you learn more of these spells, you'll be able to do things like temporarily improve your defense, transform into a fairy to bypass platforming challenges, or even shoot fireballs from your sword. Improving on the moveset was also a key factor when we look at the other side of the coin. While Simon Belmont keeps the perspective and control scheme from his last adventure, his array of tools received a bunch of changes. Instead of having them drop from candles, sub-weapons can be purchased from merchants across the land, and then be selected at any moment. Since Castlevania's combat system was simple yet effective, the developers felt it didn't need that much tweaking and dumped all of their efforts into everything else. And I can't say that was a bad decision. Whipping and jumping feels tight as always. The key aspect of Simon's Quest is the fact that its world is yours to explore at your own leisure. While some dungeons will be locked until you obtain a certain item, you are allowed to explore in whatever direction you want. Similarly to Zelda II, this sequel to Castlevania picks up soon after the end of the first game. Unbeknownst to him, even if he was able to defeat Dracula, before going into his slumber, he cast a terrible curse upon the vampire hunter. This spell caused his body to slowly decay, and 7 years after, he's at the brink of death. That is, until a young woman appears before Simon's eyes, and tells him that in order to free himself from the curse, he must recover the pieces of Dracula's body so he can be brought back to life, then slay him again to undo the evil spell. This plot setup is directly related to the new features introduced in this game. Your whole adventure somewhat runs under a time limit, since Simon has 7 days before the curse ends his life. Every day lasts around 10 in-game minutes, and is divided into 2 halves. During daytime, enemies will be weaker, but they will drop less rewards upon being defeated, and during nighttime, undead creatures are restored to their full potential, while increasing the bounty that they leave behind after their demise. It may sound simple nowadays, with games that have day-night cycles much more complex than this, but in 1987 this was absolutely revolutionary. One common complaint attached to this system is how, because towns are closed down during nighttime, you might have to sit still and wait until sunrise to progress through the game. However, this is also a part of the main challenge. Because time stops while you're inside a mansion or a house, you can take a breather if you need to and plan out your route to the next main objective. Of course, you won't know how to properly use your time when you first run through this game. That is understandable. But since defeating Dracula can only take you about a few hours, the replayability factor is very strong. And that factor is boosted by the existence of multiple endings, which change depending on how many days have passed since the start of the adventure. This leads me to mention how Castlevania II punishes its players in case they fail. While Zelda II has a life system that will send Link back to the starting point once those are depleted, albeit keeping his full inventory intact, Simon's Quest will allow you to continue playing right on the spot, even after losing all of your lives. However, you will also lose all experience points and hearts upon continuing. Because experience leads to increasing Simon's health, and hearts act as currency and ammo at the same time, this means that Castlevania II doesn't take away your progress in a literal manner, since you can always fight a few enemies and put you back to speed once again. What it does, instead, is take away some of your time and make your end goal harder to achieve. I find this to be a very clever design choice that builds upon what Castlevania had established. In that game, losing a life would also take away your hearts, sub-weapon and whip upgrades. What this creates is a sense of momentum as you gradually make Simon stronger throughout the stage. Keeping that momentum was part of the challenge, and it became a reward for skilled players, since the better your tools are, the easier the game gets. That idea had to be adapted to CB2's map design, and I believe they did a nice job by not hurting your chances of beating the game, but lessening the possibility of achieving the best ending. But what is a journey without the destination? Zelda II and Simon's Quest will not only have you explore new places and towns, but also will have their heroes stepping into dangerous territory. Dungeon design can be very challenging by itself. You need to create a maze that's fun to explore and solve while being comprehensible enough to avoid frustrating the player. The Legend of Zelda is often praised for having dungeons that are brilliant when it comes to gating the progress of the player by using keys. However, these keys can take many shapes, like defeating a set of enemies, interacting with NPCs, or, well, an actual key. When Zelda II and Castlevania II tried to incorporate the ins and outs of an adventure game into their dungeon design, they had to diverge. Simon's Quest is a game that puts a lot of emphasis on exploration. Thus, every mansion comes in the form of a massive building that extends both vertically and horizontally. In this case, those keys only take one appearance, that being the merchant that sells you the oak stake. Once you have this weapon, you only need to find the orb containing Dracula's body part, and then throw the stake. While very simple, the game makes an effort in proposing an increasingly difficult challenge as you get into the last few dungeons. Because the key never changes, the developers increase the difficulty by adding stronger enemies, platforming challenges, and making the merchant harder to find. Some of these even have a boss at the end, but since they are hilariously easy, I don't think they matter too much in the grand scheme of things. Zelda II, on the other hand, they programmed the entire combat system, and they were going to use the entire combat system. Palaces in Adventure of Link feel like an adaptation of what made the first game great, but with a different angle. Keys still take multiple shapes in this game. To make progress, you'll often need to find a new item, survive a room filled with enemies, or find a key. The key difference... that was an accident. The script says the big difference. I'm gonna let that in, actually. The big difference is that this is a much more demanding game in terms of player skill. Puzzles are far more complex because the scope has been expanded upon, and getting to those keys is not as simple. Some involve using your magic, others want you to be smart when picking your fights, and others are a knowledge check to make sure you have done your homework before stepping into this place. But not only do you need to find the solution to these riddles, now there are also platforming challenges and a wide variety of enemies that are definitely going to make your life much harder. So, studying enemy patterns and having quick reflexes is also one of the keys to survival. And no enemy shows this better than the huge monsters you find at the end of every palace. They demand quick fingers, a clear mind, and a nice knowledge of what Link can do. I think the perfect example of the combination of these concepts is shown in the Maze Palace, which is usually the fourth dungeon you visit. You can come in here at any time after picking up the raft hidden inside the Island Palace. However, you will not be able to clear it on your first go. Karok, the boss of this place, requires Link to use the Reflect spell to have a chance at winning, since sending his magic blast back at him is the only way to deal damage. This spell, on the other side, requires you to rescue a captive child inside the maze, and to get to him, you need to pass through the river using the boots that you find inside of the palace. This is the first time in the entire series that you need to, literally and figuratively, think outside of the box, and I believe that is a very interesting way to design a dungeon. On your way to most of these objectives, you'll have to battle through a wide variety of enemies. Darknuts, Stalfos, Tektais, each one of them has a very different pattern that demands a specific thing from you. Thing is, aside from the enemies found in palaces, you can always run away from an encounter by reaching the boundaries of the battle screen. So, if it's possible to ignore half of the fights you'll face throughout the game, why bother with them, right? That is why the experience system is a game changer. Both sequels implemented this mechanic in different ways, so that the player's main character can evolve as the adventure goes on. In Zelda II, you gain experience points after defeating enemies or picking up P-bags. Once you reach a certain threshold, it's possible to increase one of three stats. The amount of customization offered by this system is pretty surprising for its time. Whenever you trigger a level up, the amount of points you need to increase that parameter once again will grow more and more. That way, the game will ease you into balancing the growth of your hero by telling you, hey, maybe next time you should upgrade something else. The coolest part is that you can choose to skip a level if you really want to invest in something else. As a result, when you take into consideration the upgrades and P-bags found throughout the world, you as a player will always have a reason to explore every nook and cranny, and you will always have a reason to engage in battle with your foes. And that is because both are going to help you to conquer the next challenge. Castlevania II is far from being this advanced, but while lacking in complexity, the development team led by Akamatsu had done some very revolutionary things of their own. Simon's Quest doesn't have the intricate combat system or varied enemies of Zelda II. What it has, on the other hand, is a very interesting concept of experience points. As I said before, hearts in CV2 are both your ammo and your currency, and the only way to get them is by defeating enemies. At the same time, however, whenever Simon picks up a heart, he will also gain experience points. Get enough of them and he will level up, which will increase his defense and maximum health values. What makes this idea very interesting is that Castlevania II implements a limiter to this system. This is done by giving each enemy something similar to a level of their own. If Simon's level is equal or lower than the opponent's level, he will gain experience from them. But if you are stronger than your foes, you'll notice how Simon won't gain any more points. This is done to discourage players from grinding, and essentially breaking the progression of the game. It goes without saying that this was a very innovative idea for an adventure game, and the proof is how this very same idea went on to be featured and expanded upon in Symphony of the Night, and those games that came after it. We got the Chrysaligrim! Although it's true that I said that CV2 lacks the complexity of Zelda II's gameplay, the riddles are still a big part of the experience. So much so that they are the most critiqued aspect about this game. Every mansion except the first one is locked behind a puzzle, like using a magic crystal to summon a tornado and fly to the top of a cliff, or lifting the curse that prevents the ferryman from taking you to the end of the Dead River. Of course, if we only look at the puzzles themselves, you will probably wonder how are you even supposed to figure this out. If you recall earlier on the video, Zelda II and CV2 are often criticized for having useless in-game clues, making progress impossible unless you use an external guide, like Nintendo Power. But then, let me ask, are they really that impossible to clear? Let's take a look. The gameplay loop in Adventure of Link has you, the player, following a sort of cycle. Upon arrival to a new town, you can find NPCs that will give you a short mission to obtain a new spell or technique from the town's magician. In the meantime, you can speak to the rest of the townsfolk to find out how to get to the palace. And once you complete said mission, you can go ahead and make your way through it with some extra knowledge in hand. To people back in the early 2000s, when this game's popularity saw a massive spike, these clues meant nothing. Quoting one of the reviews I showed during the intro, the NPCs speak useless garble like I am error. This fellow found inside the town of Ruto became infamous online, with people referring to his line as one of the biggest mistranslations of the NES era. Hilariously enough, this is not a mistranslation, but a very silly joke from the developers, who named two specific NPCs as Error and Bagu or Bug. Leaving that aside, I would lie if I didn't say that Zelda II has a very robust English localization. Except for a few occasions where the solution is a bit cryptic, you can easily make your way through the game if you take your time to talk to these people. Not only do they give clues on where to find heart containers and other upgrades, but they will also help you to not run into challenges that you won't be prepared for. A nice example is this lady in the town of Ruto, who says, "Do not go south without a candle," warning you that if you haven't cleared the first palace, where the candle is located according to the townsfolk in Rauru, you should probably avoid heading into Death Mountain. Heck, even I am error is a clue. Later in the game, you'll find an NPC that says that Error from Ruto knows how to enter a secret tunnel that will take you to the island palace. And since I'm sure you remember the way he presents himself, this is an oddly good clue. It is undeniable on the opposite side of things that Castlevania II suffers from a less than optimal English localization. Everyone knows about the "you now process" thing, and how many of the dialogue boxes attached to NPCs seem to give you useless information or straight up lies about how to proceed throughout the game. Interestingly enough, if you look at this game's original Japanese version, you'll realize how the townsfolk giving you incorrect information is not a problem with the localization, but an intended decision from the developers. A bunch of years ago, programmer and content creator Biscuit uploaded his results after taking a deep look at both versions of the game. The English translation is indeed flawed, with many clues becoming either vague information or, in some occasions, useless text. A quick example would be a flame flickers inside the ring of fire, which in the Japanese version reads as "the holy fire rests in a place that never sees sunlight," hinting at the placement of the flame subweapon, which is hidden in a cave. Despite the botched dialogue, though, it was a very odd experience to witness how most of the lines deemed as translation errors by internet commentators, like the infamous "hit Deborah Cliff with your head to make a hole," are very close to the original counterparts. In this case, the lady originally said something along the lines of "hit Deborah Cliff with your head and see if a hole opens," which almost sounds like a very snarky way of saying "go screw yourself." You might be asking then, why would the developers go out of their way to purposefully spread misinformation inside their own game? Well, allow me to ask you a question instead. When looking at these two games and their NPCs, have you ever stopped to think about what your character means to them? In Zelda II, you are Link, the hero that once saved Hyrule years ago. Thus, it is clear to see why these fellows would do all in their hands to aid you on your mission. In Castlevania II, you are Simon Belmont, the descendant of a banished family who defeated Dracula, but who is also blamed by the townsfolk as the reason why evil monsters are coming back to torment them again. So having people telling you stuff like "get back" or "I warned you to not come back" makes a lot of sense. This difference in direction is part of what makes the world building in these two games so genuinely impressive. Zelda II takes place in a fantasy setting, so rumors and legends are likely to be true. In Simon's Quest, however, the setting is more grounded, trying to portray a 17th century Transylvania. So it makes sense for the urban rumors to be straight up lies, just how real life sayings usually go by. In the Japanese version, lies were indicated by characters opening their lines with "it is said" or "I have heard", and sadly, this was lost in translation, making it much more difficult to differentiate the two types of clues. Another issue attached to the English version of CB2 is the removal of the map that came with the Japanese version's box, forcing you to go and buy it from somewhere else if you need one. Despite all of these issues, I still think you and most players can beat this game without using a guide. Yes, there are moments that will likely take you some time to figure out, like crouching at Deborah Cliff to summon a tornado, but thankfully most of the clues regarding directions on how to get to each mansion are decently translated, and you will probably be able to make sense of them. Well then, I think I've said enough already. It is finally time to answer the big question about these two infamous sequels, and the title that has been given to them for many years. Are Zelda II and Castlevania II the black sheep of their respective franchises? Are they bad games in otherwise legendary sagas? Well, the short answer is no. But the long answer I shall explain in the upcoming minutes. So, going back to the definition of a black sheep, to say these two games are a blemish, or a shame to the rest of their series as a whole, would be a bold yet untrue statement. Looking at how Zelda II and Castlevania II were perceived up until a few years ago, you would think that these two games have always been bad. That, however, couldn't be further from the truth. These two were incredibly well received back at their release, with Famitsu giving a 36 out of 40 to Zelda II, and despite the botched translation, Castlevania II was giving resounding scores by Video Game Press at the time. Up to 1987, Famitsu had only given a score higher than 35 to just two games. Up until Zelda II came around, and that 16.5 out of 20 given to Simon's Quest by Nintendo Power was enough to place it in the 15th spot of their best NES games chart. And despite their successors seemingly discarding most of their mechanics, the influence of the traits that made these number 2s unique shouldn't be understated. Zelda 2's deeper combat and introduction of NPCs would go on and influence the complex mechanics and sprawling worlds of future games, like Ocarina of Time. Castlevania 2's focus on exploration and its introduction of RPG mechanics would then be featured on Symphony of the Night, one of the most beloved games in the franchise. Their presence can even be felt throughout the entirety of the respective sagas, thanks to the many references to these two shown in later entries. The sages in Ocarina of Time are named after the towns in Zelda 2, and the Great Palace is still the only stage to represent NES Zelda in Super Smash Bros. Something from Castlevania 2 appears in every game that came after it, like the town of Algiba being part of the first stage in Rondo of Blood, or the late game in Symphony of the Night having Alucard recovering the very same pieces of Dracula. Simon's Quest also gave us Bloody Tears, a song that went on to become the most popular piece of music in the entire franchise. While also appearing in some form in almost every Castlevania soundtrack. Without these two, The Legend of Zelda and Castlevania would not be as we know them nowadays. Blemishes these two ain't, what they are instead is beloved pieces of their respective series of video games. That said, I think it's time for me to wrap this up. Simon's Quest and The Adventure of Link are not perfect video games, and judging them by today's standards makes their flaws easier to spot. Zelda II is ruthless, and Castlevania II suffers from a barely decent translation. But it is also important to know that their impact on how games are made is relevant even decades after their release. The late 80s were a different time for this medium, and these two games are the living proof of how game developers were willing to push new boundaries, even if it meant risking everything on a daring move. In the end, they managed to push the adventure genre even further, and they showcased how these small cartridges could hold entire worlds inside of them with a degree of detail and personality that would seem impossible on paper. One thing I have come to notice is that games don't age in the way most people think. Classics are not outdated because they degrade over time or become worse with the passing of years. They age because what they did decades ago has been improved and evolved upon by those who came after it. Nowadays, we still see games that combine exploration with a very exigent combat system, and games where deciphering clues to discover new places is the main focus of the gameplay. Even if sequels have a standardized model in our present, these two games helped pioneer very creative ideas, and that shouldn't be glossed over. Thus, their label as black sheeps and worst games among their peers is certainly an unfortunate one. Although times are changing, the era of angry reviews and over-exaggeration has slowly retreated, and the reputation of these two sequels is seeing a change in recent years. I think the most positive outcome we should take from this situation is that sometimes these old games require a different approach to fully grasp what they were going for. Next time you go for a run through Castlevania II or Zelda II, maybe you can try writing down the clues as you play, or drawing your own maps and guides. What I'm trying to say is, while we can judge games by what they are now, and that is perfectly valid, sometimes it's possible to find a newfound appreciation for a game if we judged it based on what it was upon release. But no matter what happens, it will be forever clear that, whether if you think that they are good or not, these two sequels were something special, and they still are more than 30 years later. This has been the story of the world's most infamous black sheeps, and the long-standing legacy they have left behind. This is BurnCrowSP, and thank you for watching.